And so for today, we are going to be spending the next 90 minutes going over a lot of content. Oh, Matthias, will you go to the next one, the agenda? We'll be sharing a few minutes about Conservation International and the coffee sector in general. Then we'll move into the launch and the growth of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. We will then hear from partners in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. We're very pleased to have with us today a representative from Starbucks and from the Specialty Coffee Association, who are going to give some reflections about their thoughts on the challenge and how they engage. And then we will move to a breakout group, a few minutes. We'll spend a few minutes having smaller conversations on the topic of multi-stakeholder engagement. And we'll end the 90 minutes with a looking into the future and a wrap up. Today, and as many of the GCC workshops, the format is meant to be interactive. We will have poll questions throughout the session. And we'll also have pauses for questions and answers. And as I just mentioned, we'll have time to reflect a little bit in smaller groups. If at any time you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or chat in the chat box. And we also encourage you to note in the chat box your name and your organization and your role, just so that others within the call can see who else is on the line. So with that, I will hand over to Bambi to walk you through the background of the challenge.
Thanks, Raina, and thank you again to the UNDP team for this opportunity to speak with you today. And really thankful to our guest speakers from Starbucks and especially Coffee Association. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to share with you some of our experience about the Sustainable Coffee Challenge and how we started it up and why we started it up and what we've learned over the past 5 years of facilitating this multi-stakeholder initiative. So Matthias, can you go to the next slide? Sorry, and you can keep going to the next two. Okay, so within Conservation International, we're an environmental organization working to conserve nature for the benefit of people. And so our key line that we use every day is that people need nature to thrive, and we need to show the value that nature provides to people. And one of the areas that we've been working on for quite some time, so in the over 20 years that I've been at Conservation International, we've been working on sustainable coffee. And the reason for that is that we work to conserve nature in the tropics. And usually these are mountainous forest areas that are also home to coffee production. And so we started working in coffee because it was in and around the important forest areas that we've been trying to conserve. And we needed to find a way to work with communities on sustainable production in a way that also helped conserve the species and the ecosystem services that these natural areas provided back to these communities. And so we've been working on coffee ever since in terms of good agricultural practices, community engagement. And then a few years ago, we felt like there was a need to expand the scope of what we were doing, not just with individual communities and individual landscapes and individual companies, but to move beyond that to working with the entire sector and trying to leverage some of the leadership that we were seeing in the sector to really spark a movement of like-minded organizations and actors to try and make coffee what we consider the first sustainable agricultural product. So Matthias, can you go to the next slide? Next slide. Okay, so what we found was that we understand that really people drive movements, and we always considered the Sustainable Coffee Challenge as a movement that was going to be necessary to spark the change that we want to see in the coffee world. And, you know, we've seen these types of movements pop up left and right over, you know, the past century. We've seen the impacts of Greta Thunberg in, the young climate activist in Sweden and what she's been able to start up. And now we see the protests and everything moving in terms of what's happening in the United States as well. So we felt like now is also the time for this type of, movement in terms of, trying to get more actors together to address the critical conditions and situation that we're facing in coffee. So we have the impacts of climate change on coffee. We have impacts of leaf rust, which is a devastating disease that significantly impacts production of coffee and the livelihoods of the producer communities themselves. When coffee yields decline, their livelihoods also decline. We've had issues of labor, who's going to pick and harvest the coffee that we all love to drink. And we've seen issues of child labor, forced labor issues in some countries that we know that we need to do a better job of addressing. And then we also know that we have, an aging farmer population and poverty within coffee communities. And so we need to be looking at who's going to be growing the coffee in the future and making sure that this is a prosperous industry for the coffee growers themselves. Next slide. So we felt that even though we had been working with individual companies, individual communities for quite some time, we need to move to scale. And so just like one coffee bean does not equal a cup of coffee, it takes many coffee beans to produce a cup of coffee. We felt that we needed to move from individual action to industry level engagement. Next slide. And that's where we use this hashtag, and you can keep going through, Matthias. We use this hashtag sustain coffee. So the long name of a sustainable coffee challenge doesn't feed nicely into Twitter or hashtags. So we felt like we needed a different hashtag. We do use this one on sustain coffee. And it's really just like, we can't have just one individual trying to hold up a sign and saying we're doing the right thing. And that's kind of what we had seen in the industry for quite some time, of like individual actors really trying to lead and pull and push the industry forward. But it was time to really try to figure out, how do we get more of these actors to speak to one another in the same language and really try to say, we need to change the coffee world altogether. Next slide. And so the only way to do that is to come together in a initiative, multi-stakeholder initiative that represents the private sector, the public sector, civil society, associations, all working together to tackle some of these big challenges that I just mentioned, and to do so together. We could no longer do this individually within individual supply chains. We had to be thinking beyond supply chains, into landscapes, into communities, to be getting at the change that we needed to see. And no one coffee company or no one organization could do that at the scale that we were looking for. Next slide. And so when we started up the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, we did quite a lot of listening. We felt that that was very important. We had some ideas of what this could become, but we felt like we needed to listen and understand, where is the coffee sector, or where was it in 2015 when we were starting this up? And who was doing what within the sector? And was everything covered? And if everything was covered, why were we still seeing this, some of these crises hit? And why were we still feeling that there was a need or something that else was needed to start to drive this movement forward, or catalyze a little bit more action by different actors across the sector, not just the business as usual, and not just the usual suspects in terms of leadership. And so what we looked at was, we looked at this model that was developed by New Foresights together with IDH and the IFC and a number of others on the sector transformation model. This will not look exactly like the sector transformation model that they developed. We actually revised this a little bit and tried to simplify it for the sake of the coffee sector. But what we found interesting in it was that it clearly depicted some of the key functions that would be needed to transform an entire agricultural sector. So of course, we need producer support services, training, research that's going to actually help us produce better coffee and sustain coffee production into the future. We need government systems that support coffee production systems in a sustainable manner and support nature conservation and improve livelihoods. Those government policies are critical to making this all happen. We needed to have strengthened demand. So the market demand side was also very important to make sure that if farmers are doing the right thing, if producers are implementing the best practices, that's being purchased and recognized as such in the marketplace. We also realized that there was a need for platforms for sector coordination and action, and there were some already existing in the coffee sector at this time, and some were just starting to emerge. But what they all needed to come together was this shared vision of what are we trying to achieve, how do we think we can achieve it, and how do we push forward within that. When we started out the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, the place that we saw the biggest kind of gap was in that strength and demand side. And we initially started out saying we were going to really focus in on the strength and demand, like really push for more market uptake of sustainable coffee in the sector. We quickly realized that, you know, as we focused there, we had to address some of the other issues and opportunities that you see also listed here. We had to work more closely with the other platforms. We had to think about a common sustainability vision and framework for the sector as well. And we needed to make sure that even though we were talking about demand initially, that demand could come from all of us. It could come from the public sector, the private sector, the NGO community. We should all be pushing and pulling for and demanding sustainability within the sector. So we quickly expanded the definition of, I think, what the sector transformation model developers meant by strengthening demand, because we felt like there were some bridges that needed to be built within some of these other buckets. Next slide. So I think that takes us to our first poll question. Can have that pop up. And here we just want to know a little bit more about you who are participating on the call in terms of where your work currently focuses, because you want to make sure that we know which sectors we're talking to. And we're hoping that what we've learned from the coffee sector has great applicability to the other commodities as well. So please click on the ones that, or the one that is most aligned with your focus. And there's also a multiple commodities one that you can click on if it's more than one of these. Okay, so it looks like we have a lot of coffee people on the call, which is great. Some palm oil, some cattle and fisheries, and most people are working on multiple commodities, which is also great. So really hoping that this experience can provide more insight in terms of how this could work with these other commodities as well. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Raina, who's going to talk about the launch and the growth that we've experienced within the Sustainable Coffee Challenge over the past 5 years.
Thank you, Bambi. Matthias, will you flip to the next slide? So as Bambi mentioned, recognizing kind of the need to tackle some of the most pressing challenges facing the long-term sustainability of coffee, we launched the Sustainable Coffee Challenge alongside the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris back in 2015. And at that time, and continues to be, but at that time, we really were thinking about how to spur a coalition that works across the coffee sector with the vision of making coffee the world's first sustainable agricultural product. And when we say that, we mean really how do we ensure the prosperity and the well-being of farmers and coffee communities and sustain supply of coffee while also conserving nature. And so, Matthias, could you flip? At that time of launch, we launched with 18 partners. And today, nearly, well, about 4.5 years later, we are at 149 partners in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. That number changes sometimes on a weekly basis as we've grown continually since the launch. As part of the partners, there's about 84 countries represented. And I'll speak a little bit to some of the work that we're doing within the challenge, of course, around commitments. But just to tee that up, there's 67 partners that have public commitments stated in our commitments hub, 104 commitments total. And since the start of the challenge, we've unlocked $2 million in investments. And just to see a little bit about the reach, we send out a monthly newsletter that has nearly 700 people subscribed. So you can tell over the 5 years, there's just been tremendous growth from, I think, what our team and our friends at Starbucks, who were fundamental in launching the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, never even anticipated, at the time of launch. And could you move next, Matthias? So just to show you who is part of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, we have a couple of slides that show could you go back one? Members in the private sector, civil society, and associations. As you can see here, we have a big range of private sector, from small traders and coffee shops to large retailers and roasters and grocers that are part of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. Next. We also have a large membership of civil society and associations. We have all of the standards and the certifiers as part of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. And we also have, as you can see, the logos at the bottom of this slide, the Coffee Association of Canada, the Specialty Coffee Association, which Kim represents, who will be speaking later, the National Coffee Association, the British Coffee Association, and the African Fine Coffee Association, all engaging in this effort. Next. And in addition, we've been pleased to have agencies from the US government engaged, but also countries engaging in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge and putting out public commitments to sustainability investments as well. So here you see the Uganda Coffee Development Authority, you see the government of Mexico, Costa Rica, and a regional government of Peru, and also Rwanda. Next. And so just taking a step back, as we started thinking about how do we get to impacts at scale, we've developed kind of where we think the theory of change of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge is. To get to impacts at scale, first we need partners to understand opportunities and have incentives to act. With that, we believe that those opportunities lead to new commitments and additional investments in coffee. And the hope is that as there's more commitments and more transparency on commitments, there's also opportunity for collaboration among like-minded actors. And so this is what we stick to as our theory of change, and kind of has been the basis for a lot of the actions that we've taken under the challenge. Next. And so just to point out, over the first 5 years, and again, I'll move into some of the detail behind this here, but over the first 5 years, we've been able to align the sector around a common sustainability framework. We spent probably the first year of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge really digging into what were some of the actions that the coffee sector were taking, where are some of what's the definition of success for the coffee sector, etc. We also work to increase transparency of sustainability commitments across the sector. And we launched a commitments hub within the sustaincoffee.org website, where we encourage partners to state public commitments and then report progress against those. And those commitments are not filtered by our team. They're we are openly encouraging partners to take a step or make a commitment where they are, and hopefully as commitments have matured, they will make more ambitious commitments into the future. And then we've also worked at building trust and partnerships through collective action networks, which I will move into next. Matthias. And so as we started digging into how do you accelerate change, we took a step back and looked at where is the coffee sector today. And Matthias, I think that there's 3 animations there, if you want to just move through them. Thank you. So as you can see in this matrix, there is a scale of low action to high action and low awareness to high awareness. And while people can be unaware, and that's the reason for low action, they could also be acting, but very misguided. And to get people into that top upper right hand box, we really thought that we need to work more on how to incentivize people to do the right thing, and at the same time raise awareness on the importance of acting. Next. So back in 2017, we launched what we call collective action networks. And this was based on input and feedback from partners in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, who helped guide us on choosing the themes of these collective action networks. And we currently have 4 themes. One is on scaling up sustainable sourcing. One is on coffee renovation and rehabilitation. One is on improved labor practices and supply, which is led by the Rainforest Alliance. And one is on mapping and monitoring of coffee and forest. And just to mention, the scaling up of sustainable sourcing has been led by Fair Trade USA in partnership with our team for the last several years. So the idea of these collective action networks were precisely to do what I mentioned in the previous slide, raise awareness and also incentivize and hopefully get to scale. So as you can see in this flow chart, some of the things that we've been working to do as part of those action networks is first identify different types of reports or tools, or even just compiling information about those topics that I mentioned, and disseminating them in bite-sized, easy to understand formats. A lot of this information that we've pulled together also provides kind of proof of concept, and hopefully starts supporting additional investments. And so where there hasn't been information, and that's been the case in several of the groups, we've started trying to fill those information gaps. So in the case of the Renovation and Rehabilitation Network, which I happen to lead, we had the support of USAID and Dalberg to develop a really in-depth renovation guidebook that started digging into a lot of the case studies, the context, the need, and became a real great manual for those practitioners and program developers who were interested in incorporating renovation and rehabilitation into their work. And so as we continue to engage on the journey of the collective action networks, we're also trying to get to how do we work together to expand and mainstream initiatives at scale. And when we do work at scale, when we do work together, where and how is best. And so next, Matthias, if you can. This is just a sample of some of the outputs from the networks, which are available on sustaincoffee.org, that are downloadable to anybody who's on the site. And so we encourage you to look at those if you have specific interest in a topic. But more so than anything, this is just to show that this is the exact way that we're really trying to get to that raising awareness so that we can move to incentivizing people to act. Next. And so I also mentioned that we've really been working hard to increase transparency of sustainability commitments across the sector. And as part of our work on the Commitments Hub, this last year, we were able to start downloading and analyzing the data from the commitments that have been stated publicly. And we put out our first report on kind of the progress across the sector, what we're seeing in terms of commitments. And so as you can see, based on the commitments that are stated, the coffee sector is investing about $531 million in those sustainability commitments. That's at the aggregate. That's not on per annum basis. There, at the time of the publishing of this guidance or the report, there was 27 stakeholders making commitments, 33 total, and of those, they had tagged that about $380 million was going towards global actions, while $151 million was going to specific countries. And so this was our first published report on kind of the analysis within the Commitments Hub, but it starts giving us some texture and some idea of what we can or could be dissecting in terms of public commitments or into the future. And so although that the Commitments Hub is a really great tool, we also hope that this annual report can drive more transparency and incentivize more people to use the hub and state their commitments. Next, Matthias. When we also looked at those commitments, we noticed that the private sector is leading the way in stating commitments. So as you can see here, sums up to about 51% of the commitments were made by private sector actors. And there's also, though, still room, as Bambi mentioned at the very beginning, that demand we see can be driven by people even outside the private sector. You can tell that there's also other public commitments made by nonprofits and other associations or universities as well. Next, Matthias. And interestingly, the largest proportion of the commitments in the hub were dedicated to sourcing policy. So I think, Matthias, there's some animation there if you want to go through. I think there's 3. So 35% were related to sourcing. And over a third of the sourcing commitments also tag some form of standards or certification that apply to their commitment. But we were also really happy to see that almost the same amount were tagged at addressing climate change, and another 30% related to technical assistance. Next. And there's an animation there, Matthias. So we also started looking at when our commitments set to mature, and something that really jumped out to us is that over 55% of the commitments that were stated in the hub were actually meant to mature or to be hit this year in 2020. So Bambi will be talking a little bit later about the future of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, but this to us presents a really great opportunity to help companies and other organizations start thinking about what are some of those post-2020 commitments and where in the sector do we need to be investing deeper, and help try to formulate and guide some of those commitments into the future. So with that, we'll go to the next poll question, and then we'll open up for a Q&A, because I know that Bambi and I have just thrown a lot of content at you. So Matthias, if you open the poll. So here we're interested in hearing your feedback on what do you think is the primary value in participating in a multi-stakeholder initiative? Is it knowledge, recognition, opportunity for partnerships, networking, funding, risk mitigation, or other? So just take a moment to vote. And then Matthias, how's it looking?
Yeah, I'll show the results in a minute.
Okay.
Well, not a minute, in 20 seconds.
Sounds good. Okay, so great. So it looks like almost about half of you really think that there's value in opportunity for partnerships. And then it's spread pretty evenly across knowledge, recognition, networking, funding, and risk mitigation. And then about 15% say other, which I think would be interesting to hear when we get into either the questions or our breakout session, to hear from those who think other, to hear what that other is. So Matthias, if you want to move to the next slide, I think now we will pause and open up for questions on what we've shared so far. So please feel free to either chat it in the chat box or raise your hand, and Matthias will unmute you.
Jaime?
Yes, go ahead. Matthias, was there somebody that wanted to speak?
Yeah, I think it was only a mistake. Jaime just wrote on the chat box.
All right, great. Well, don't be shy, please.
Marlon has a question.
Okay, there we go.
Hello there, good morning. Thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, just one simple question related to the question that popped out in the survey. I see the partnerships as a means to an end, not as an end itself. So in your opinion, this it looks fantastic, the level of partners. It's really encouraging to see all this community coming together. But what will you say that are the three, perhaps, yeah, 1, 2, 3 main results of being in a partnership? Is it policy reform? Is it financing? Because it seems that in the questions it was a mix of ends and means. So I wrote other, but what are the results of this partnership, the key impact of these partnerships? That's it.
Thank you. And thanks for that question. Maybe I'll jump in here. This is Bambi again. It's a great question. And I think, being 4.5 years in, that's still really unfolding. We've spent a lot of time, as Raina and I just mentioned, doing a lot of work to try and figure out, okay, what's out there that people could be using to make better decisions? Why aren't people using it? And, what else is needed to try and drive these types of partnerships and investments forward? So I think we spent a lot of time there, and there's a lot of outputs that we've created. And now as we embark on this next phase of the challenge, it's really about we've done all of our homework now, and now we need to figure out, okay, is anything really changing because of what we've set out to do? And so what I'm going to be talking about a little later on is some of the goals and targets that we're now setting to be a little bit more directive in what we're asking for of the sector. But I would say, we can think of everything from like, okay, hectares under better management, improved livelihoods for producers and workers, and how much improved are we talking about? Can we talk about carbon benefits? Can we talk about uptake of sustainable sourcing within the marketplace? Like all of those things are things that we should be tracking and monitoring better within the coffee sector. But we have a little bit of ways to go to get there. I think what we have now is a pretty good baseline of where we are that we can now track from. And I would say in terms of some of the theory of change and how the collective action networks work, we felt that there's a huge jump or almost like a barrier that you have to overcome to move from that idea of like, we can all collaborate on research. That's pretty easy to do. Collaborating at scale in different jurisdictions or landscapes is something that we feel like it's going to take more incentives, more leadership from key actors to really get to. And that's something that we're trying to unpack a bit more of, like, what are the incentives that are needed to really drive that type of collective investment and action? We have some examples of that we've tested. One is that we did a campaign late last year. It was called Plant Trees Save Coffee. So we were trying to get financing for renovation of coffee farms and for shade trees on coffee farms. And that was one area where we chose places that we felt we could go into, and we knew we had boots on the ground and capacity to actually implement those programs. And we were able to raise about $250,000 or a little more than that in support of a few initiatives there. So that was our first kind of foray into like us selecting some places, selecting some interventions, and trying to raise money for that collective programming. We're going to revisit that and see how we can do more of that. And we're also trying to find ways of putting together collective proposals for certain landscapes where we know that there's tremendous need, there's tremendous interest by the private sector and the public sector to move that forward. So there's a lot more that we're doing, but it's a long way of saying that, I think we've done a lot of our baselining and homework now, and, watch this space over the next few years to see if we're actually getting to that point of making that difference that we want to see.
Great, thanks, Bambi. I also saw a chat question come in about a question about if we could provide some examples of the types of commitments that we're seeing in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. And as we mentioned, a lot of the private sector commitments, though not all, have had something to do with sourcing. So, X% sustainably sourced by X date. Others have been around specific investments, supporting of, as we've mentioned, crop renovation or technical assistance. And then some have been more project-based. And I encourage you to look at the sustaincoffee.org site. There's a section called commitments where you can scroll and look through different commitments by actors, and you can see what have been the commitments that have been stated to date. And as I mentioned, they do range in complexity and ambition, and we're okay with that. We're really happy that that people come and, we're meeting them where they are in terms of their engagement in sustainability. And if you're just starting the journey on sustainability and your commitments might be initial, we're really happy to even see companies take those first steps. In terms of governments, I've just pulled up one from the government of San Martin in Peru. Their commitment is around enacting a protocol that will establish the legal framework to grant rights for agroforestry systems over areas where coffee plantations have been established. Other governments have more production-related commitments. that they've stated that are aligned with some of their coffee engagement plans for their country. So that's just to provide a little bit of context there. Were there any other questions? Okay, if not, if you do have a question, we'll have another Q&A spot a little bit later. But for now, Matthias, if you want to move on to the next slide. I wanted to jump into a little bit about some of the key reflections. And so this here is a statement that we partnered with Synergos last year, who did a strategic review as we were looking to think about how do we move from the first 5 years to the next 5 years. And as part of that review, they did a listening session and multiple interviews with partners. And really the feedback came that, you know, the Sustainable Coffee Challenge is considered to be a knowledge platform with effective sharing of resources, information, and tools, especially on the conservation and environmental side. But it also brings transparency in the sharing of commitments, creating a commitments hub and leveraging collaborative action. And so that is what others have stated as some of the value that the challenge has added to the sector. But today we wanted to bring in voices from partners. So we have with us Kelly Goodyjohn. Matthias, if you want to move to the next slide, who is the VP of Global Coffee Sustainability and Education at Starbucks. And we also have with us Kim-Elena Ionesco, who is the Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer at the Specialty Coffee Association. So private sector and also a representative from an association. Both Kelly and Kim have been along with us since the very beginning of our journey on the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. And we wanted to bring their voices today for them to share some reflections on the value that they see. So I'll start with you, Kelly, if you want, and Matthias, if you can unmute Kelly so that she can have a few minutes to share her experiences with us. And thanks, Kelly, for joining us.
Oh, sure. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening. For me, it's 6:44 in the morning. I'm in Seattle. So I am drinking a fresh cup of coffee that I just brewed. It actually came from our farm that we have in Costa Rica. And thanks, Raina and Bambi, for the opportunity just to share a few minutes of why we felt the Sustainable Coffee Challenge was such a move in the right direction. And for us as a company, the value that we've gotten out of it. And I certainly, welcome questions as to our intention at any point. So my name is Kelly Goodyjohn. I've been with Starbucks for 14 years. I lead our coffee, tea, and cocoa sustainability efforts, strategy, as well as our coffee engagement and education work, which really is, if you think about our 400,000 employees around the world, how do we get the tools and information about coffee for them to both feel inspired and connected to the product, as well as share with their customers. For Starbucks, we're an almost 50-year-old company, and we know that the success we've had as a company is largely dependent and is certainly reliant upon the success of the coffee farmers, their families, and the communities in which we source from. Hands down, if we don't have high quality coffee, we won't be able to grow as a business as we'd like to. We have been partnering with Conservation International for over 20 years. I think the origin of our partnership is unique in that, Starbucks is knows quality, where to find quality coffee, how to get quality coffee, and Conservation International knows the environment and sustainability and conservation. And they approached us 2 decades ago and said, we're working with some farmers in Mexico, and we believe that you should buy their coffee. They're doing all the right things. And to be honest, we tasted the coffee and the quality wasn't there, but instead of just passing it by, we saw an opportunity, and working with Conservation International, together we were able to actually create our buying guidelines, which we call cafe practices or coffee and farmer equity. And we still implement that today. And we believe that is the right way for farmers to grow coffee in a way that's both good for people, the planet, and for farmer livelihood, because it helps improve quality, productivity, and all the things that help smooth when you're talking about coffee during some of the volatility. As Starbucks, we work with over 400,000 farmers. Over 95% of them are smallholder farmers across 30 countries. We buy approximately 4% of the world's coffee, so significant, but sometimes people think we might buy more than that. And I'm proud to say that as of 2015, all of our coffee, I should say 99.8% of our coffee, is ethically sourced through our Cafe Practices program. Again, thanks to the partnership with Conservation International over 20 years ago. As a company, we also know that having good buying guidelines is just one of the actions. We've developed a network of farmer support centers where we have agronomists across Central America, or Latin America, Asia, and Africa to help farmers implement these practices. We have made commitments to donate 100 million trees to farmers over the next few years. We already have 50 million or 40 or 50 million in the ground at this point. We have a loan program to get $50 million of low interest financing to farmers so they can reinvest in their farms. And we also have our farm that we purchased in 2013 in Costa Rica, which really serves as a research and development hub as well as a working farm. So we know what it's like to be a farmer, and our R&D team can work on new climate-friendly coffee varietals that we want to share with the industry. And I should say our philosophy around everything is open source. So whether it's what we're learning, the challenges we're finding, or the research and development that we have found as a company, all of that is open and shareable. So at this pivotal point in 2015, when we reached our goal, we had a goal of 100% ethically sourced coffee. We hit the 99% ethically sourced coffee. And I should add the last 1% is because of the new supply chains we are including into our network, and we work with them to get them into the Cafe Practices program. But in sitting down with CI at their offices, I remember very vividly a conversation we had, and it was, should we, as our partnership, dive deeper, in coffee and actually try and create an industry venue? Or Starbucks, are you interested in moving to another agricultural product? Maybe let's work on tea, or let's think about dairy. And it was really, really important for us to think about coffee, and not just what we have done across our two organizations, but the potential and the ability to open this up and create a platform for actors within the coffee sector to come together, to learn from one another, to share what they're hearing, and to work together towards a common vision. So I think what Bambi outlined in the earlier part of the presentation of the vision and what we're committed to, for us really resonated, because what I had seen were lots of great efforts that were happening within the coffee sector, us included, but everything working singularly, but in parallel with one another. And so this really was an opportunity for us to come together to get some scale and to get some speed. Starbucks made the decision to fund the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. I believe we're the primary funder of the challenge still today. And that was very intentional to make sure that there was a low bar of entry for organizations to join, that instead of funding the setup of an organization, they, roasters, retailers, others could invest in origin. We wanted to make sure that the dollars of members were working in origin, and we would cover the great work that CI is doing. We believe as a community that all of this is pre-competitive, and that the coffee sector needs immediate action. With climate change and other economic challenges facing coffee, it is more important than ever that we address this together. And so that's why we decided to strongly support the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. I think we were at the table during the early days, but I also want to stress that this was never intended to be a Starbucks initiative. This is a coffee-led industry initiative and shepherded by the incredible work of Bambi and her team over the last nearly 5 years. And we also have an ambition that, you know, we believe that by bringing all of us together, there's an opportunity to pull resources and partner across the industry in ways that we haven't as a sector before. And I think that's why this conversation is so exciting as we look at what the potential could be and how coffee could serve as that example for other crops and commodities. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for your great reflection and kind of historical memories on how we got to where we are today. I really appreciate your time and what you've shared. I want to hand over to Kim Elena. As I mentioned, Kim works at the Specialty Coffee Association. And right before the Sustainable Coffee Challenge launched in 2015, Kim stepped into her role there at SCA. And as I said before, has been very involved from the onset of discussions and the formulation of the challenge. So Kim, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Raina, and nice to be here, everyone. So yeah, my name is Kim Elena Ionescu. I'm the Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer at the Specialty Coffee Association, which is a membership association for the coffee industry. It's headquartered in the United States, but we have staff and we have members and stakeholders in more than, I think, about 70 countries around the world. And that includes both coffee producing countries and coffee consuming countries. We've been around for about, going on 30 years now, maybe even a little bit longer than that as an association, started by a group of volunteers. And it began in the United States as an association that represented more roasters and the roles that are adjacent to coffee roasting. So retailers and importers than probably anything else. And that's the background that I have. I bring with me to the association. I joined in 2015, as Raina said, and it more or less coincided with the beginning of the exploration of this idea that would become the challenge. And I'm telling you all of this, first of all, because I think that that specialty coffee is probably something that if I had more time, we could go into more depth about what specialty coffee is and isn't and all of the potential there. But because we are an example of an association or a platform that works collaboratively with the challenge, acknowledging that there are ways in which our work overlaps and more ways in which our work can complement the work of the challenge. So when I began my work with the Specialty Coffee Association, which was then the Association of America, we had a merger a couple of years ago and now have a more global purview. But I was the first sustainability staff person. And at the time, that was a reflection of the fact that there was a lot of interest from the volunteer community and from the members, roasters, retailers, also, producers and other supply chain actors. But it was still a comparatively small group of people and also tended to be kind of a self-selecting group that verged on activism at times. And there were a lot of really great things about that, a lot of advantages to having like-minded people working together. It's easier to build consensus. But it was also not clear how to become involved, necessarily how to learn, what a pathway would be for someone who wasn't necessarily self-identifying as a sustainability expert or aficionado, or just someone who was interested in learning more. And so one of the things that if I can remember back that far, that I feel like I understood about the challenge then, and I certainly understand about it now as a real advantage and a tool for our sector, and certainly the specialty coffee industry, is that it's a zero barrier to entry sustainability platform. So, there are ways in which I believe that the challenges, webinars and tools and resources have helped to level the playing field in sustainability where at times I think it can be seen as where there can be barriers to entry for people to participate, and some of those barriers persist. I mean, we could talk about language or all sorts of access, but by not requiring someone to join with a membership fee, by hosting action networks that were open to anyone to participate at their, as their schedule permitted or their interest, compelled them to permit. I think it made sustainability feel a lot more inclusive and a lot more accessible than it had been previously. When I said that I had joined the Specialty Coffee Association in a sustainability role that didn't exist before, but there at the time wasn't a place where there wasn't a dedicated sustainability platform for coffee. So building this, I think, has really accelerated a lot of the onboarding that has happened for coffee sector actors. And I also see that openness brings along with it its own set of challenges. Not to be too tongue-in-cheek with the name, because that we end up on every Action Network call with people with varying levels of experience with sustainability broadly, with whatever the Action Network topic is, whether that's sustainable sourcing. Bambi and Raina both alluded to the importance of sustainable sourcing commitments as far as industry or private sector actors go, or labor, or reforestation, something that I feel like is really farther outside of what many, or coffee and forests, what many private sector companies, especially small ones, really feel like they have any expertise in. So there are always a lot of people who are showing up to learn, and trying to drive from the learning stage into the collaborative action stage is a path that's rife with obstacles. And so I think that one of the things that I have learned over the course of these years is that modulating expectations for the pace, or being able to predict that the path that each of these action networks say would take is very difficult when you have this commitment to being open and inclusive. And so the different action networks have moved at different rates depending on who's involved in them, and how broadly or narrowly the groups define their scope for collaboration or activity. And that brings, I brought that back to my work at the association, where our sustainability team has grown since I joined in 2015, but we still face a lot of the same kind of questions when it comes to trying to drive for action more quickly with groups that are maybe more homogenous, or where we are really furthering a model that is, or promoting a model that is one private sector actor, one company, and one NGO working together, which is a very familiar model, versus a much slower, potentially slower process that involves multiple companies trying to coordinate their commitments, or potentially multiple NGOs trying to coordinate their methodologies for data collection, or something to that effect. And I don't think that there's a right answer there, that we should be acting more faster, or we should be slowing down and collaborating. I think that it's, for me at least, a daily practice of remembering that it's depending on the circumstance, or the desired outcome, the impact we're trying to achieve, that each of those, or along that spectrum, there are many different ways in which to move forward in the name of sustainability. So I'll pause there, and but happy to elaborate on anything further that would be useful.
Thank you so much, Kim. Again, some really great reflections. from your participation and also kind of parallel work at the association. So we thank you so much for taking the time this morning. Bambi? And I think Kelly and Kim might have touched a little bit on some of the things that you were going to highlight in the next slide. Matthias, if you want to move forward.
Great, and while he's doing that, just want to echo Raina's thanks to Kelly and Kim for their reflections on this. I mean, they've been key partners from the beginning, and like Kelly said, we started this up with an idea, and really grateful to Starbucks for helping us make that idea into what it is today and providing the financing to make that happen. And then Kim was also, we brought her in really early to try and figure out, okay, how would this, sit alongside of what the SCA was doing on sustainability, and really trying to bring more voices to that table of how do we form something out of nothing at the time, out of an idea. So they've been at this with us for quite some time, and they both sit on our advisory council as well. So I won't belabor these points, but I think Kelly and Kim both hit on these already in terms of some of the key reflections over the past almost 5 years of this, is that we did want this to be a low barrier to entry. You heard Kim talk about that. You heard Kelly talk about this as well. And there are pros and cons to that. So some people feel like, well, if they're not paying a membership fee, are they really there? We've done a lot of work to look at, how active the partners are. We've categorized partners in terms of sleeping versus, awake partners and active partners, and have outreach to the ones that might be a little bit sleepy, to try and get them more engaged and figure out what those barriers might be. Also trying to think about the long-term financing of this, and how do we transition to having more organizations and companies supporting the Sustainable Coffee Challenge in a voluntary way, still not trying to, not requiring it, but saying, if you value this, would you support it? In terms of unlocking commitments, I think there has also been a key desire for more guidance and direction on this. I think launching the first Commitments Hub report resulted in a lot of new commitments. And it incentivized people to kind of take stock and see, why don't I have a commitment up there? Or is my commitment, have I reported on it? Is it recent? So that's helped unlock some of those new commitments. We've tried to keep the governments quite lean. We have an advisory council, but it's a lot of volunteer, or staff time, volunteer time on the part of Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade USA and our advisory council, moving these things forward, trying to get to faster action, participatory decision-making, and then this idea of collective action. I think there's a lot of reflections on, in theory, it all sounds great, but at the end of the day, organizations and companies are still looking to have a leadership, role in this, and want to be recognized for their leadership. And so what we can do collectively versus what we can do individually and share lessons learned, we're still learning about that. And when are people really ready for collective action? How do we facilitate that better? And when do we need to provide a framework under which individual actions can also be counted? So we're doing a lot of thinking about that as well. Next slide. Okay.
So we are going to now take about 10 to 15 minutes in breakout groups, and have a couple of discussion questions that we will lead as kind of some discussion starters, just to run through those. What are some of the biggest challenges you have seen while working in collaboration with others in your sector? If you have specific examples of actions or activities that have improved engagement, or even which industry do you think is best positioned to engage in collective action? So Matthias will drop us all into breakout groups, and we hope that you'll participate with your group, and then we'll come back together to hear what the future of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge looks like and wrap up. So thank you, Matthias, if you want to send us.
Matthias?
Yes, hi.
Can you just, I'm sorry, or maybe it's too late, because I pressed by mistake the button to go back.
That's fine.
And yeah, I think it's fine. I'm gonna say sorry to my group later.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everyone. I see people are just joining us back. And we still have people dropping in. So I noticed that we're running tight on time. We have about 8 minutes left. And while I'd love to hear from each of the groups on some of their reflections, we unfortunately don't have time. I really enjoyed speaking with my group and who had some really great insights. And I hope that you all had a chance to dive into these questions as well. But with that, Matthias, if you can move on to the next section. I'm going to hand back to Bambi to walk us through, how we've taken the first 5 years and as a foundation and what we're doing as we look to the future for the Sustainable Coffee Challenge.
Thanks, Raina. And hopefully I'll address some of the things that we talked about in our group, and hopefully some of the things that might have come up in the other groups as well. So Matthias, can you do the next slide? So as we mentioned, we have worked over the past several months with Synergos to try and take stock of what we've achieved and what we still need to do as part of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. And we've really taken this feedback to heart in terms of, the feedback really came back in terms of these 4 categories of leadership, strategy, reporting, and culture. And I won't go through all of this, but some of the clear takeaways was that we needed to be bolder, more ambitious, ask for more, be clear on what our asks are, prompt more commitments, make sure that people are reporting on their commitments, and remain inclusive, think more globally. Those are really the key ones, and people appreciated the transparency of the commitments themselves as well. So the feedback was that we've built the right culture. Now we need to leverage that culture and be a bit more specific in terms of what are we asking for, so that we can actually lead towards some of the changes that we want to see. Next slide. So we mentioned this earlier on in terms of climate change being one of the big challenges that we're facing over the next 5 and into the next few decades. But the big question that the coffee sector is asking today is, how do we maintain a diversified supply of coffee that meets growing demand at a time when we're seeing that demand grow and grow and grows? We might need 2 to 3 times the amount of coffee we have today by 2050. That's about 4 to 14 million tons per year additional of coffee. In order to get there, we would need to double or triple production on existing farms. And we're trying to do that at a time when climate change is cutting in half the suitable area for coffee production. And then a lot of that suitable area is under forest. So that 60%, based on our estimates, of the suitable land for coffee is in forest. And as climate change pushes coffee into higher altitudes, that pressure on forests is only going to increase if we can't figure out new ways of producing more coffee on the existing lands. And as Kelly mentioned in her comments, we're doing this at a time when we've always seen volatile commodity prices in coffee. Right now, the volatility is at a low. And so you have climate change, you have low coffee prices, and you have aging coffee farmers. And the question is, like, who's going to produce the coffee into the future? And are we going to have this diversified supply that we've actually had over the past many decades? Next slide. So when we've been thinking through this, we've been trying to think about, okay, how do we think about this as a coffee sector in terms of a response? And we know that nature is needed to be about a third of the climate solution. Coffee is a part of nature, and it is able to grow in and around natural systems. And so we need to be starting to think about coffee as a nature-based solution to climate change. And so what we've been doing over the past several months is trying to calculate what that potential is for coffee. And this slide shows you some of those calculations, but the key takeaway is that the total carbon benefit from sustainable coffee could be upwards of 1.6 to 3.4 gigatons of carbon. How we get there is basically looking at how do we avoid deforestation so that we don't need to clear 10 to 20 million additional hectares of forest to grow the coffee into the future. We get most of the carbon benefit from just that avoided deforestation. We get some additional benefit by looking at what coffee production systems look like today, especially in terms of full sun systems, and can we introduce some shade systems into those to get some additional carbon benefit? And how do those shade systems help farmers withstand climate shocks, diversify their income, link them into carbon markets, and just make them more resilient to some of these impacts of climate change, and ideally more profitable at the same time. Next slide. And so when we have been thinking about this, we're trying to think about, okay, how do we take that and turn that into some goals? And so we've been in this process over the past several months since March in terms of trying to facilitate a dialogue within the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, and then also have this inform other sector initiatives as well, like the International Coffee Organization and the Global Coffee Platform, other initiatives that are also engaging with many of our partners, but even beyond our partners. And so we've taken to heart this idea of like, make more clear what we're asking for. And so we've started to set some 2050 goals, and that's what you see on the screen here in terms of, we look at this from the point of view of like, okay, we need to sustain the supply of coffee. So we need to make sure we're meeting demand, and that means doubling smallholder production on existing areas. We need to be conserving nature in terms of the restoration of 2.5 million hectares of tree cover on farms, and then conserving an additional 5 million hectares of forest. Strengthen market demand, so in transitioning entire markets to sustainable sourcing. So trying to be more clear on having companies who are in the coffee challenge make sure that they have sustainable sourcing policies and programs in place. And then working with Sustainable Food Lab, the Specialty Coffee Association, IEDH, and others in Rainforest Alliance on this improved livelihood. So making sure that coffee farmers and workers are achieving a living income or living wages, and how we kind of step into that. And we know that if we do some of these things right, we would be able to secure a significant amount of carbon through these actions. And so trying to set some clear quantitative targets for these at the 2050 level, and then some first 5-year targets for how we break this down into 5-year increments. Next slide. And so what we heard, we do an all-partner meeting every year, and we had one in March just before COVID-19 hit the world, or as it was starting to hit the world. And one of the feedbacks in that session came from the private sector saying, well, could you know, these are great targets, we love the targets, we love the goals, shouldn't these become sector-wide pledges that we should be asking all the partners to sign up to? And we've been trying to think about how do we get people to sign up to a sector-wide pledge. And of course, we can think about this from like the behavior change theory of, we need to raise awareness of the particular issue, make sure that everybody understands that it is an issue. We would have to align on a definition, the principles. Of course, you know, we have 60 countries producing coffee at this time. We can't work in all 60 right away. So we have to prioritize countries and landscapes where we think we can have some significant wins early on that we can build from. We have to have good monitoring approaches and tools that are aligned across the sector. We have to develop and implement commitments and joint action plans, and we have to report and adapt. This is nothing new, but it's just like, if we're thinking about industry-wide pledges, this is really what it takes to make those pledges count for anything. Next slide. So I know that I ran through that pretty quickly, and there's a lot more behind it in terms of the science and the estimations and all of that we're starting to share more and more with the partners in the challenge, and even far beyond the existing partners. We're expecting in July to come out with a first draft of these revised goals and targets, and then in the fall, in September, October timeframe, to start to have, you know, some commitments lined up from our partners so that we can go out and say, this is really where we're heading together, and let's move forward in pushing this agenda forward. So with that, I'm going to stop. So we have a few minutes for any final Q&As before we have to close this out.
Just to mention, since we are at the end of our time together, if you do have any other questions that aren't able to be addressed right now, we would be happy to either have a follow-up call or send some thoughts on email. And we'll also be sending the presentation and some links to resources where you can dig in on your own as well.
There's one question from Michael Seeger on the chat box.
Okay, so Mike has asked, how are biodiversity values of coffee producing landscapes being incorporated into definitions of sustainable coffee? And are there commitments related to improving biodiversity in coffee production?
It's a great question. So biodiversity has been incorporated into the certification standards for many, many years. So those are in the standards if you're doing certification or verification. In terms of how we're using biodiversity to prioritize countries of where we would work, we're looking at this from, of course, a biodiversity lens in terms of forest cover, conservation importance, key biodiversity areas, protected areas, all of that, of like where does coffee sit alongside of forests and how important are those forests for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and other values. And so we have a scope of work with support from the Walmart Foundation that we're doing with CIAT, Rainforest Alliance, the Sustainability Consortium, I'm forgetting another partner, and ourselves to try and map coffee and forests in Indonesia and Colombia just to start this process so that then we can identify key landscapes based on biodiversity, ecosystem service values that we know that we need to be targeting for avoiding future deforestation from coffee or trying to reforest areas that would expand the extent of important protected areas. So biodiversity does play into this. We're incorporating it into our forest and coffee and climate network as a key kind of criteria for selecting some of these places that we would try to drive collective action.
Great, thanks for that answer.
Okay, well, just being respectful of everyone's time, we will wrap up. And if you have any other questions, again, we'll send an email, a follow-up email, the GCC team will be, and we'll have Bambi and my contact information. And you can always shoot us an email after that. Thanks again to the organizers, to the UNDP team, and for all of you who have joined us this morning or this afternoon to talk about coffee. We really appreciate giving us an hour and a half of your time and hope that the rest of your day, wherever you are, is a great one. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bambi. Thank you, Raina. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.